Welcome back to AP Banned Books with Madison. Today we're going to be talking about a book you'll be surprised to know is banned. I've noticed I've been talking a lot about banned books in the US, however, banning books is a problem internationally. So let's talk about a book that has been banned in England, China, and Australia. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. If you have read Jane Eyre, you'll be shocked to know this, but Jane Eyre was banned in both China and Australia for claims of morally corrupting the youth. Which just makes me wonder if these people even read these books, or if they just listen to like one angry parent. As for England though, Jane Eyre wasn't banned until people discovered that the author was a woman. You can see here on the original title page that the author wrote under the pseudonym Currer Bell, the same initials CB as for Charlotte Brontë. And once Charlotte Brontë claimed the novel in a Parisian salon, people started calling this book promiscuous and starting rumors about Charlotte Brontë herself. But not only is there so much more to this fascinating book, it's actually one of my favorites, but there is so much more to Charlotte Brontë. So as always, let's start with some biographical information about the book and the author, followed by a brief summary, then some key themes, and then literary devices and literary techniques. As you can tell from the title page, Jane Eyre was published in 1847 in 3 volumes. But you'll also note here that it says it's an autobiography. An autobiography is a book written about the person who is writing it. So does that mean Charlotte Brontë is Jane Eyre? No. This was a popular style in the Victorian era that evolved from novels like Robinson Crusoe, where people really wanted to read novels that were actually true. They weren't really into books as entertainment yet. They felt that everything had to give them some sort of knowledge. But it was widely understood that autobiographies were in fact fictional. It was just a nice little trick Victorians could tell themselves. But Charlotte does take a bit from her own life when writing this. Most people know Charlotte Brontë as the eldest sister of the 3 Brontë sisters. But in fact, Charlotte actually had 2 older sisters. They sadly died away at boarding school, which is what inspired the plotline for Lowood, the boarding school that Jane Eyre goes to in the book. While that served as inspiration for Jane Eyre, the actual reason that Charlotte Brontë wrote Jane Eyre is because Charlotte's 2 other sisters, Emily and Anne, argued that it was impossible to make a heroine interesting on any other terms than her physical appearance, i.e. her being perfectly beautiful. Charlotte Brontë answered, quote, "I will prove to you that you are wrong. I will show you a heroine as plain and as small as myself, who shall be as interesting as any of yours." Which is where we get started in our summary of Jane Eyre. So for the first 10 chapters of the book, Jane is 10 years old. Both of her parents have died, so she is given to her uncle, Mr. Reed, who also dies, so she's stuck with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, who is evil. She's also stuck with her 3 awful children. The Reeds, as well as the servants, mentally and physically abuse Jane, calling her ugly, worthless, stupid, saying she's like demonic. But Jane is actually incredibly intelligent, and she actually stands up for herself. She's not a meek heroine, which will probably be really enticing to readers, as well as this fantastic prose style that is really easy to read, especially for the time period. But the adults of the house don't care, and they lock her in this creepy red room, which is where we get introduced to the paranormal aspects of this novel, because it is a gothic novel. The Reeds eventually get sick of Jane, so they send her away to boarding school at Lowood. Lowood is a school for orphan girls, and Jane's not as mistreated as she once was, but she's like not being fed at all. It's clear that the teachers are like very strict. But eventually Jane makes a friend named Helen Burns, who is really religious and really tries to help Jane get through this. Unfortunately though, Helen and a lot of the other girls die of a disease. And if we look at the footnotes of the edition I have, we will see that Lowood and its unhealthy conditions are based on Cowan Bridge School, attended by Charlotte and 3 of her sisters. Her eldest sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, sickened at the school and went home to die of tuberculosis. Brontë modeled Helen on Maria's character and intelligence. It's at the end of chapter 9 where we get a time skip of about 8 years, and Jane lets us know, but this is not to be a regular autobiography. I am only bound to invoke memory where I know her responses will possess some degree of interest. This kind of fourth wall breaking is something we'll talk about later, but I really think it makes the novel stand apart. Anyway, Jane puts out an ad in the newspaper to be a governess, which is basically a tutor. This is a really distinguishing factor of the novel, where I feel like a lot of novels of this time period, things really just happen to the characters, but Jane is actively seeking out change. Jane gets a reply from a manor called Thornfield to tutor a young French girl named Adele. Jane goes there and notes how creepy and big the house is, but she doesn't really mind because now she has her independence. After a few weeks tutoring Adele, Mr. Rochester, the owner of the home, comes back to Thornfield, and all of a sudden we've lost all of Jane's character development. I want you to picture Mr. Rochester as Mr. Big. Because he practically is. Jane is 18 and Mr. Rochester is estimated to be between 35 and 40. The novel itself says so. And even if you try to ignore the weird age gap just to enjoy the romance, he brings up repeatedly how he's old enough to be her father and calls her young girl or young lady. Anyway, Mr. Rochester has a fun time calling Jane Eyre names, and she doesn't really seem to mind for some reason. That is until one night Jane starts hearing laughing from the 3rd floor. Like a weird demonic laugh, and the servants tell her that it's just another servant who's kind of weird. So Jane goes about her life until one night Mr. Rochester's curtains are set on fire. And Mr. Rochester's, oh, that's just that pesky servant. And Jane's like, girl, what? Like, I'm gonna interrogate this servant. She doesn't really get anything from the servant girl, so... Skipping ahead a bit, Mr. Rochester pretends to be engaged to someone else to make Jane jealous. It kind of works, and then he eventually proposes to Jane, which is where we get the famous line, "I am no bird and no net ensnares me." But she says yes. But she is miserable leading up to the wedding, and Mr. Rochester notes this and starts calling her names, but also being affectionate, but then also pinching her ear and grabbing her. But Jane says she likes this better than his affections and compliments, something we should note that we'll get back to later. So the night before Jane's wedding, a figure creeps into her room and literally rips apart her veil. Jane just goes back to bed, and then during the wedding, someone interrupts and says Mr. Rochester can't get married because he's already married. And that's when Mr. Rochester takes us back to Thornfield, and we find out that the person laughing in the attic, her name is Bertha, and she is Mr. Rochester's wife. And she's been the one laughing maniacally, setting things on fire the whole time, not the servant girl. To make the 3rd act of this book short, because it's kind of weird, Jane flees in the night, starves for 3 days, and then meets these people who she ends up finding are her cousins later in the book. But then her one male cousin wants to marry her and wants her to move to India with him as a missionary. And she's nah, and she goes back to Thornfield. Only to find out that Thornfield was literally burned down. She finds Mr. Rochester in this cottage with 2 of the other servants, and he is literally blind and missing a hand. Mr. Rochester explains that Bertha killed herself, and Mr. Rochester tried to save her. He got all the servants out before he himself was crushed and hurt in the fire, making himself blind and cutting off his hand. And then Jane and Mr. Rochester get married and have a kid. The end. I'm not even joking. So I like to associate this character recession, I would call it, with Jane's trauma. Jane throughout her whole life has been told she is ugly, unwanted, and stupid. And we see she's internalized this way of thinking in her inner monologue. So it's no wonder that Jane is comfortable with Mr. Rochester, a man who is brazenly rude to her, but sprinkles just enough affection in it for her to be okay, I'm devoted to him. Literally at one point she says she would die for him. But it's interesting that Jane only becomes comfortable in the relationship when Mr. Rochester becomes dependent on her because he is both blind and kind of crippled. She has just the right amount of autonomy because he needs her, but also a good enough level of servitude that doesn't challenge what she's used to, what she thinks she deserves. Jane is stuck in a cycle of abuse, but we kind of only get the takeaway of "Reader, I married him." It's a happy ending. But like Virginia Woolf famously said, we don't read Jane Eyre because of the characters or the plot, but the amazing prose. I don't know if I'd fully agree with that because I do think some of the plot twists are quite riveting in this, and I do like Jane Eyre as a character, but there is no doubt there is no writing like Charlotte Bronte's. And for people who are just getting into classics, I promise it's incredibly easy to follow. Especially if you get a Norton Critical edition. I have the 4th one, and it comes with footnotes that will help you. Like always, if you have questions, please let me know in the comments, and let me know what book you want me to talk about next.